The road into Tranquille follows the north shore of Kamloops Lake in the Thompson-Okanagan country of British Columbia, where the brown hills come down steep to the water and the sky opens wide above the sage-covered benches. The lake is pale blue-green in summer. The buildings are still there on the lakeshore, most of them. Some have been renovated for a winery and resort. The stone foundations of others stand in the grass between the road and the water, open to the sky, their walls reduced to courses of masonry that hold their original footprint without holding anything else. It is a beautiful location. It was always a beautiful location. That was the point. But the beauty was never the story. Between 1907 and 1958, more than 9,000 patients were admitted to the Tranquille Sanatorium for tuberculosis. They came from across British Columbia, from Vancouver, from the Kootenays, from the Caribou, from the fishing communities of the coast. They came because the sanatorium offered the only treatment available, the only thing that medicine could credibly offer to a person who had been told they had consumption: the rest cure, the mountain air, the milk diet, the graduated exercise that would strengthen the lungs until the body overcame the infection on its own. This was the Tranquille Sanatorium, built by a province that believed, or found it convenient to believe, that the high, dry air of the Thompson Valley was medicine enough for one of the most lethal infectious diseases in human history. It became, across 5 decades, a place where hope was the institution's most important product, where the science behind the hope was weaker than anyone said, and where the people who had come seeking healing worked the fields and filled the temperature columns and died in a setting so beautiful that the dying, from a distance, looked almost like living. If the history's hidden inside the places that look like healing, the beautiful ones, the well-intentioned ones, are the kind you want to keep recovering, subscribe, and stay with me. To understand what Tranquille became, you have to understand the tuberculosis epidemic that built it, and the particular character of the medical theory that stood, for 40 years, between a dying person and any honest accounting of what was happening to them. Tuberculosis killed more people in the 19th and early 20th centuries than any other infectious disease in the Western world. In 1900, it was responsible for approximately 1 in 7 deaths in Canada. It killed slowly. Not the sudden violence of cholera or influenza, but a grinding progression of cough, fever, night sweats, weight loss, and the gradual dissolution of the lung tissue that gave the disease its older names: consumption, the wasting sickness, the white plague. It killed the young with a particular cruelty. Its peak incidence was in adults between 15 and 35, the years when a life is just becoming itself. The sanatorium movement emerged from the work of Hermann Bremer and his student Peter Detweiler in Germany, who had observed in the 1850s and 1860s that some patients with tuberculosis appeared to recover in mountain settings, in the cold, clean air, far from the crowded cities where the disease spread fastest. Their observation was real. The mechanism they proposed was not. They believed the high altitude and fresh air directly attacked the bacillus, or strengthened the lung tissue in ways that allowed the body to contain the infection. What was actually happening, in the cases where patients improved, was more likely a combination of factors: rest from the labor that exhausted them, better nutrition than they had received in poverty, separation from the overcrowded conditions where reinfection was constant, and the natural history of tuberculosis itself, which in a minority of cases resolves without treatment when the immune system is given adequate support. The improvement was real in those cases. The explanation for it was wrong. But wrong explanations, attached to real observations, produce real institutions. By the early 20th century, the sanatorium movement had spread across Europe and North America, generating dozens of large residential facilities in which tuberculosis patients were offered the rest cure, the mountain air, and the hope that the two together constituted medicine. Physicians who had no treatment to offer found, in the sanatorium doctrine, a framework in which telling a patient to rest in a beautiful place became a clinical intervention rather than an admission of helplessness. The patients who came to these places were not deceived by cynics. They were managed by people who believed, who had constructed elaborate clinical rationales for believing, that what they were doing constituted effective treatment. This is the specific difficulty of Tranquille's history. The harm it produced was not the product of cruelty. It was the product of a system that had organized itself around a hope, and then found that it could not afford, financially, institutionally, professionally, to abandon the hope, even when the evidence against it arrived. The Anti-Tuberculosis Society of British Columbia was incorporated in 1905, 2 years before Tranquille opened, by a coalition of Vancouver businessmen, physicians, and provincial government officials who had observed the expanding sanatorium movement in Ontario and the eastern United States, and determined that British Columbia needed an equivalent institution. The driving figure in the Society's early years was Dr. Charles Fagan, the BC Provincial Secretary of Health, who combined a genuine concern about the tuberculosis death toll, which was running at alarming rates in Vancouver's working class and immigrant communities, with the practical understanding that an institution visible enough to demonstrate the province's progressive public health credentials was worth building. Fagan identified the site at Tranquille on the north shore of Kamloops Lake, on the basis of its altitude, its dry climate, its distance from the coast's damp air, and, a factor that the promotional literature did not emphasize, but the institutional economics clearly required, its proximity to arable land that could support a working farm. The provincial government contributed initial capital. The Anti-Tuberculosis Society ran the institution through its early years under a provincial mandate. Within a decade, the province had assumed direct administrative control. The first patients arrived at Tranquille in October of 1907. They came by train to Kamloops, and then by wagon road along the lake. The institution that received them had been operating for 6 months. The main building was complete, the wards were furnished, the farm had been broken and planted. The staff who greeted them were committed, in many cases, to the sanatorium ideology, with something approaching religious conviction. The air here healed, the rest here healed, the milk and the sunshine, and the removal from the disease-saturated atmosphere of the city were the instruments of recovery, and the institution's role was to provide those instruments as purely and as completely as possible. Several of the first cohort of patients wrote home in the weeks after arrival. Their letters describe a landscape that genuinely surprised them: the blue-green lake visible from the ward windows, the dry hills terraced against the sky, the quality of silence at night that people who had grown up in cities or in the crowded coastal settlements could not quite account for. One patient, writing to his wife in Vancouver in November of 1907, described the air as tasting of something he could not name. He said it felt like the beginning of something. He died at Tranquille in the spring of 1908. He was 31 years old. The buildings that rose on the Tranquille lakeshore between 1907 and the mid-1920s constitute one of the most deliberately therapeutic architectural programs in Canadian institutional history, designed not simply to house patients, but to embody, in every material choice and spatial relationship, the sanatorium cure's promise that the environment itself was the medicine. The main building sat closest to the lake, its south-facing galleries projecting toward the water to maximize the number of hours each day during which patients could be exposed to direct sunlight. These galleries, long wooden porches running the full length of each ward floor, were where patients spent their prescribed rest hours in wicker chairs, wrapped in wool blankets regardless of season, their faces turned toward the light that the cure required. In summer, the galleries were warm and bright. In the Thompson Valley winter, they were cold in the particular dry way of that climate, not the wet cold of the coast, but a cold with a quality of clarity that the physicians described as beneficial, and that the patients experienced as simply cold. The gallery railing was low enough to rest your arms on. The lake was visible for miles in both directions from the upper floors. In the right season and the right light, with the hills brown gold behind and the water pale below, it was a view that could convince you that a place this beautiful could not be a place where people died. This was, in a sense, the sanatorium's most effective therapeutic instrument. Not the air, not the milk, not the graduated exercise, but the persistent, daily, visual argument that the setting itself made for hope. The farm occupied the flat ground east of the main building and extended up the bench above the lake. By the mid-1920s, it ran to several hundred acres: vegetable gardens, an orchard, a dairy barn, a piggery, poultry houses, and the grain fields that supplied both the institutional kitchen and a surplus for commercial sale. The farm superintendent's office sat at the junction of the field roads. His records, submitted quarterly to the sanatorium's administrative committee and then to the provincial government, documented acreage, yield, and labor hours, with the thoroughness of a public institution accountable to its funders. One column in the farm superintendent's records listed labor source by category. The categories were paid civilian staff and patients. On each patient's bedside table sat a glass thermometer in a small metal case. Twice daily, at 6 in the morning and at 6 in the evening, a nurse came to each ward, and each patient placed the thermometer under their tongue for the prescribed number of minutes, and the nurse recorded the reading in the chart. The reading was the institution's primary clinical data point. It told you whether the cure was working. The cure was working when the temperature stayed below 99 degrees Fahrenheit and declining toward the normal range. The cure was not working when it did not. The thermometer was issued on arrival. It was the first object the institution gave you. It was the last object returned when you left, by discharge or by another means. For its first decade, the Tranquille Sanatorium operated with the buoyant optimism that the sanatorium movement generated wherever it established itself, the particular institutional energy of a place that believed it was doing something genuinely progressive, genuinely helpful, genuinely at the frontier of public health practice. The early staff were, in many cases, ideologically committed to the sanatorium cure with the conviction of people who had watched tuberculosis devastate their communities and had finally found something, a framework, an approach, a body of published clinical literature that offered an alternative to helplessness. They believed the air healed. They believed the rest healed. Some of them had data that appeared to support the belief. Patients who arrived in advanced stages of the disease sometimes stabilized. Some improved enough to be discharged. The success cases were visible. The failure cases were buried in the institutional cemetery on the hill above the farm. In the early years, seasonal rhythms organized institutional life in ways that genuinely made the setting feel therapeutic. Spring brought the planting of the market garden, and patients who had been confined to the galleries through the winter were permitted outdoors in supervised groups. The first graduated exercise of the cure. Walking the paths between the buildings, sitting in the sun. Summer was the institution's most hopeful season. The lake sparkling below, the hills fragrant with sage, the galleries full of patients in wicker chairs reading, writing letters, talking in the particular careful way of people who have been told that strong emotion is bad for the lungs. Patient correspondence from the early years of the institution has been collected by the Kamloops Museum and Archives and by BC Archives researchers. Reading it, you encounter people in the process of adapting their entire sense of the future to a single question: whether the temperature column is moving in the right direction. One woman, writing from the female ward to her sister in New Westminster in the summer of 1912, described her daily routine with an attention to detail that suggests she understood, even then, that the details were all she had. What time she woke, what the lake looked like at that hour, what the nurse's name was, what the temperature read, whether it was the same as yesterday, whether it was lower, whether it was lower. The provincial government's annual reports on the institution during this period describe recovery rates, discharge numbers, and the general atmosphere of progressive care, with the pride of a government demonstrating that its investment in public health was producing results. The reports do not discuss mortality. Mortality was tracked internally. It was not prominently featured in the documents prepared for public consumption. Something was already embedded in the institutional structure that would take another 40 years to fully reveal itself. The labor assignment program at Tranquille was not introduced as an explicit policy. It grew in the way that institutional habits grow when they produce obvious benefits without attracting obvious scrutiny. By the mid-1910s, what had begun as voluntary participation in the sanatorium's farm and domestic operations, framed entirely as the graduated exercise component of the cure, had developed into a systematic assignment structure in which patients were categorized by physical capacity and directed to work assignments matched to their rating. The medical basis for the graduated exercise component of the sanatorium cure was real, within its own framework. The theory held that controlled physical activity, increasing gradually as the patient's condition permitted, strengthened the respiratory system and promoted the productive removal of infected material from the lung. The theory was published. It was taught in medical schools. It was accepted by the clinical establishment. Its institutional application at Tranquille was something the theory did not specify, and the clinical literature did not examine. The work performed as graduated exercise was work that the institution required to function. The vegetables grown by patients in the therapeutic garden fed the institution's kitchen. The dairy herd, tended by patients in the therapeutic farm program, supplied the institution's milk, the same milk prescribed as a dietary component of the cure. The laundry cleaned by patients in the therapeutic domestic program was the institution's own laundry. The exercise was both therapeutic and productive. Those two facts coexisted in the institutional record without generating, at any administrative level, the question that coexistence required. If the exercise is therapeutic, its therapeutic value is unaffected by whether it is productive. And if its productivity is valuable enough to offset institutional costs, what does that say about who the program serves? Something had begun that the institution was not going to examine until it was forced to, and the force, when it came, would arrive from an unexpected direction. Dr. Frederick Agnew was appointed medical superintendent of Tranquille in 1919, arriving from a career in military medicine that had given him both extensive experience with respiratory disease. He had managed the pulmonary wards of a Canadian military hospital in France through the final years of the war, and a practical administrator's conviction that an institution's clinical program and its operational requirements were not separate considerations, but a single management problem. He was not an unkind man. The records he left behind, his annual reports to the provincial government, his correspondence with the Anti-Tuberculosis Society's board, his clinical notes and patient files, describe someone who cared about the patients in his charge and believed, with the certainty that the medical consensus of his era provided, that the sanatorium cure was sound medicine, and that his job was to administer it as effectively as the institution's resources permitted. He had a particular gift for administrative efficiency. Under his superintendency, the farm program expanded from its somewhat ad hoc early structure into a systematized operation with defined assignment categories, documented labor hours, and a quarterly accounting system that reported farm output and labor cost to the administrative committee with the precision of a commercial agricultural enterprise. The quarterly reports were filed. They were reviewed. They showed, year after year, that the institution's food costs were substantially lower than comparable institutions that purchased their provisions commercially, because Tranquille grew its own. Agnew described the labor program in his annual reports to the province using the vocabulary the sanatorium movement provided: graduated exercise, therapeutic activity, the physical benefit of purposeful outdoor work to patients whose lungs were in the process of recovery. He believed this vocabulary. He was not misrepresenting the program. He was describing it in the only clinical language his training had given him to describe it with. What his training had not given him was the language for asking whether a man with a temperature reading of 100.2 degrees Fahrenheit, logged at 6 in the evening, should be assigned to field labor the following morning. The clinical record and the labor assignment record were maintained in separate administrative offices. Agnew's training did not include the specific interdisciplinary practice of reading them together. The irony was complete and invisible. The most efficient administrator the institution had ever had was running an agricultural operation on the labor of people whose temperature charts showed they should not be performing agricultural labor, and the documentation of both was thorough, professional, and entirely correct within its own administrative category. He was never investigated for any of it. The institutional economic mechanism that made Tranquille's patient labor program sustainable across 5 decades was not a secret. It was in the annual estimates submitted to the BC legislature. It was in the farm superintendent's quarterly reports. It was in the correspondence between the sanatorium's administrative committee and the provincial Department of Health. The mechanism was documented in the language of public administration because no one with authority believed the documentation required concealment. Federal health transfers to the provinces in the sanatorium era were tied to patient day counts, a per diem funding model that paid institutions for the days patients resided within them. The model did not distinguish between a patient receiving intensive clinical care and a patient who had been stable for months and was performing farm labor 6 days a week. Both generated the same federal per diem. An institution with a large population of stable long-term patients was financially rewarded for maintaining that population rather than discharging them, because each day, a patient remained represented a day of federal funding. the BC archives hold the financial records of Tranquille's operations across the full sanatorium period. Researchers who have examined these records have found, in the quarterly farm accounts, labor hour figures that represent, at provincial minimum wage rates for agricultural work applicable to the relevant decade, significant monetary values generated by patient activity, values that do not appear in the patient's records as compensation because the labor was not compensation. It was therapy. In the 1930s, with the Depression driving both tuberculosis rates and provincial budget pressures, the farm program expanded further. The acreage under cultivation increased. The dairy herd grew. The poultry operation expanded to supply not only the institution's own table, but a commercial egg contract with a Kamloops distributor. Patient labor drove all of it. No ethics board reviewed the labor assignments against the clinical records. No ethics board existed at Tranquille, as none existed at any Canadian hospital or institution in this era. The regulatory framework that would eventually require such review did not emerge until the late 1960s, a decade after the sanatorium's primary clinical program had ended. The patients who worked the Tranquille farm received their temperature readings twice daily. The labor assignment list was posted each morning on the ward bulletin board. No document connected the two. The daily experience of tuberculosis treatment at Tranquille in the 1930s and 1940s was organized around a graduated protocol that the institution's clinical staff administered with the consistency of people managing a physical therapy program, which, in the terms of their training and the sanatorium doctrine, is exactly what they believed it was. New arrivals were placed on absolute bed rest for the first weeks of admission, a period during which the only permitted activity was walking to the washroom and returning. Temperature was taken twice daily. Weight was recorded weekly. The sputum was examined monthly for bacterial load. All three measures determined when a patient would be moved to the next stage of the graduated protocol. Stage 2 permitted ambulation on the ward. Stage 3 permitted outdoor walking on the prescribed paths. Stage 4, light outdoor activity, was the stage at which labor assignments began. A patient at Stage 4 might be assigned to the vegetable garden for 2 hours in the morning, classified in the clinical record as therapeutic graduated exercise, classification consistent with sanatorium protocol. The pneumothorax procedure was introduced at Tranquille in the 1920s as a supplementary intervention for patients whose disease was not responding to rest cure alone. The procedure collapsed the affected lung by introducing air into the pleural cavity, forcing the lung to rest completely, while the body's immune response worked against the infection. It required weekly or bi-weekly maintenance injections of air to sustain the collapse. It was painful. It was performed without general anesthesia, with a local applied to the chest wall, in a procedure room where the patient was awake and conscious throughout. The clinical rationale was coherent within the sanatorium framework. If the lung cannot be rested by behavioral rest alone, collapse it mechanically. Some patients did respond. The procedure produced, in a subset of cases, measurable improvements in sputum bacterial load. It also produced, in a subset of cases, complications: pleural adhesions, secondary infections, mechanical failures of the collapse that required emergency intervention. The complication rate was documented in the clinical literature. It was not prominently featured in patient-facing communications. In the winter months, when the Thompson Valley cold made the outdoor galleries genuinely uncomfortable and the farm labor genuinely punishing, patients at Stage 4 and above continued their assignments. The doctrine held that the cold, dry air was beneficial. The doctrine did not examine whether beneficial was the appropriate word for what it felt like to work an outdoor assignment when your temperature read 99.8 degrees at the previous evening's measurement. One account, gathered by an oral historian conducting interviews with former Tranquille staff in the 1980s, after the institution had closed, describes an attendant who had worked the farm crew during the 1940s. He said that he had once asked a senior nurse whether patients with elevated readings should be excused from the morning labor assignment. He said she had told him that the exercise was part of the treatment and that interrupting the program was a clinical decision, not an attendance decision. He had gone back to the farm. He did not ask again. What the temperature chart showed in the files of the men working beside him that morning belongs to the next section of this story. Numbers, even these numbers: 9,000 admissions, 5 decades, hundreds of farm acres, worked by hands that were dying while working them, can become institutional abstraction. So let us remember three names. Arthur Lim was 28 years old in the summer of 1923 when he was referred to Tranquille from Vancouver General Hospital, where a chest examination had found the irregular densities in his right lung that the radiograph technology of the era identified as active tuberculosis. He was a fisherman from the Fraser River Fleet, born in Guangdong Province, who had come to British Columbia in 1912 at the age of 17 with an uncle who worked the canneries at Steveston. He had lived in Vancouver's Chinatown for 11 years. He spoke Cantonese and functional English. He had been saving money toward the eventually of returning to China, or of sending for a woman from his village, depending on which future seemed more possible. When the tuberculosis was found, both futures closed in the same afternoon. He arrived at Tranquille in August and was not housed in the main building. The institution maintained a separate residential structure for Chinese Canadian patients, positioned away from the main ward building on the institutional grounds. The rationale offered in administrative documents was hygienic. The Chinese patients were described as presenting additional infection control challenges due to cultural differences in sanitary practice, a phrase that appeared in provincial public health communications of the era as a description of a perceived risk, rather than a measured finding. The phrase was not examined. The segregation was not examined. The separate building for Chinese Canadian patients received the same meals as the main building. It did not receive the same quality of ward supervision. Staffing assignments to the separate building were, by the nursing rotation records that survive in the BC archives, consistently filled by the least senior staff. The ratio of nursing hours to patient days in the separate building was lower than in the main building by a margin that the institution's internal records document, but that the annual reports to the provincial government did not acknowledge. Arthur Lim was assigned to the vegetable garden within 6 weeks of his arrival. He worked the garden for the 3.5 years he remained at Tranquille. His labor assignment records are in the farm superintendent's quarterly reports. His name appears in them regularly, Lim A, in the section listing Chinese Canadian patients assigned to outdoor therapeutic activities. His temperature charts are in his medical file. The two documents were maintained in separate offices. The temperature readings in the spring of 1927 are elevated and rising. He died at Tranquille on the 14th of June, 1927. He was 32 years old. The cause of death recorded in the Provincial Vital Statistics Register is pulmonary tuberculosis, advanced. His death notice was filed. His body was claimed by a cousin from Vancouver. The cousin paid the cost of transport. His name appears in no memorial at the site. His labor appears in the quarterly reports. The quarterly reports are in the BC archives. Nobody has been required to read the two documents together in a formal proceeding. Dorothy Mathers was 26 years old when she was admitted to Tranquille in the spring of 1934. She had been a schoolteacher in Kamloops. She had lived only 40 minutes from the institution before admission, a proximity that gave her relationship to the place a particular irony. She had driven past it on the Lake Road before she had any reason to look at it closely. Her letters home to her parents in Kamloops were preserved by the family and donated to the Kamloops Museum archives in 1978. They are among the most detailed first-hand accounts of Tranquille, from a patient's perspective, that have been publicly identified. They describe, with the specific clarity of a young woman who had spent 6 years teaching children to observe and articulate, the gap between the institutional narrative and the institutional reality. She wrote in August of 1934, "They tell us the exercise is making us stronger. I do not doubt they believe this, but I have noticed that the patients who appear strongest are also the ones who work the longest hours, and I cannot determine which is the cause and which is the effect. I have asked doctor on the ward, and he said the exercise protocol is determined clinically. I did not press further. I do not know what pressing would produce." She wrote in January of 1935, the winter having arrived. "I was assigned to the laundry this week. The laundry is indoors, which is warmer than the garden. I understand now why the laundry assignments are considered a privilege. The privilege appears to be distributed in ways I have not fully understood." She was discharged in March of 1936, her record noting, "Condition improved. Patient suitable for discharge with prescribed rest at home." She returned to Kamloops. She did not return to teaching. Her energy, she wrote to a friend, was not what it had been. She died at home in September of 1938, 2 years and 6 months after discharge. The cause of death recorded in the Vital Statistics Register is pulmonary tuberculosis. The discharge note that certified her as suitable for discharge is in her file. The temperature chart from the weeks preceding her discharge is also in her file. The two documents are consistent with each other only if the word improved is interpreted generously. Her letters are in the Kamloops Museum. They have been cited in one academic paper on the Tranquille patient experience, published in the BC Studies Journal in 2001. They have not been cited in any provincial inquiry, because no provincial inquiry has examined what her letters describe. James Forsyth was a member of the Kamloops te Sequapemso, the Shuswap Nation, whose traditional territory included the land where Tranquille sat on the Kamloops Lake shore. He was 43 years old when he was admitted in the late autumn of 1951. He had been referred by a government physician on the Kamloops Indian Reserve, who had found the tuberculosis during a screening examination that the Federal Indian Health Services was conducting across BC's reserve communities in the post-war period. No interpreter was present at his admission. The intake documentation at Tranquille in 1951 required responses to a standardized medical history questionnaire. The questionnaire was in English. James Forsyth's English was limited. The admission record notes, patient non-communicative, history incomplete, which was the institutional description of a language barrier that the institution was not equipped to address and was not required to address by any provincial or federal standard applicable at the time. He was housed in the main building. Indigenous patients were not systematically segregated in a separate structure as Chinese Canadian patients had been in earlier decades, but the integration into the main building did not, in practice, mean integration into the institutional community. The ward records describe him consistently as quiet, withdrawn, uncommunicative. The record does not note that he had been given no one to communicate with in his own language for the duration of his admission. He was assigned to outdoor farm labor in December of 1951. His temperature chart for that month shows readings of 99.6, 99.9, 100.1. The readings are morning and evening, twice daily, recorded in the ruled column with the even professional hand of institutional nursing. The readings indicate active pulmonary disease. They are in the chart. The chart is in the file. The file is in the provincial archives. The labor assignment for December 1951 shows his name on the outdoor crew roster for 11 of the month's working days. James Forsyth died at Tranquille on the 3rd of February, 1952. He had been admitted in November. He had been at the institution for less than 3 months. He was 43 years old. He was buried in the institutional cemetery on the hill above the farm, in a grave marked with a number rather than a name, because no family member had arrived to make arrangements, and the institution's burial practice for patients without claimed remains was to mark the grave with the patient's admission number. His admission number was 8,847. The grave is on the hill above where the farm was. The number is still there, or was when the sanatorium closed. The farm is gone. The number is not a name. These three represent hundreds more. The Chinese Canadian patients who worked the farm from the segregated outbuilding through the decades of official segregation, whose temperature charts and labor records exist in separate archives that have not been required to speak to each other. The Indigenous patients, for whom no interpreter was ever provided, whose non-communicative admission records reflect not silence but language. The patients from the interior of BC, whose families were too far away and too poor to visit often, whose deaths were recorded in the institutional register and not in any larger accounting of what the institution had produced. They are owed a reckoning. The records that would constitute that reckoning are in the archives. The reckoning has not come. In September of 1943, Albert Schatz, a graduate student at Rutgers University, working in the laboratory of Dr. Selman Waxman, isolated streptomycin from a soil bacterium. Waxman had been systematically searching soil microorganisms for antibiotic properties since the discovery of penicillin demonstrated that such properties existed in nature. Streptomycin was the result. Clinical trials conducted between 1944 and 1948 demonstrated that streptomycin was dramatically effective against Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the specific bacterium that Koch had identified in 1882 and that the sanatorium movement had spent 60 years trying to address through rest and air rather than pharmacology. The Medical Research Council's landmark British trial of 1948 is among the most rigorous clinical studies of the antibiotic era. It used a randomized controlled methodology and found unambiguous evidence that streptomycin produced clinical improvement and bacteriological cure at rates the sanatorium rest cure had never approached. The British Columbia Department of Health received and reviewed this evidence through its ongoing monitoring of provincial and national health literature. The department's medical officers were aware, by 1948 at the latest, that the scientific foundation for the sanatorium treatment model had been fundamentally transformed by the antibiotic evidence. Tranquille did not close in 1948. It did not transition its primary clinical protocol to antibiotic-based treatment in 1948. It continued operating as a sanatorium, admitting patients for rest cure, running the graduated exercise program, maintaining the farm labor assignments, measuring temperatures twice daily, for another decade. The reasons were partly practical. Streptomycin was expensive and initially in limited supply, and a transition from the institutional model to outpatient antibiotic treatment required infrastructure that did not yet exist across BC's rural communities. The practical reasons were real. They were not the only reasons. The sanatorium was a large institution with a large staff and a large provincial capital investment. The closure, or radical transformation, of Tranquille would mean the loss of dozens of positions in a regional economy that the institution anchored. It would mean acknowledging to the patients currently enrolled in the Rest Cure program that the treatment they were receiving had been superseded. It would mean, in the annual reports submitted to the legislature, explaining why the province had been admitting patients to a cure that the evidence had overtaken. The province made a different choice. It maintained Tranquille at full sanatorium operation. It submitted annual reports describing progressive tuberculosis care. It admitted patients through the 1950s to a program whose scientific rationale its own health department knew had collapsed. An internal review prepared by BC Health Department officials in 1952, a document that has been examined by researchers at the University of British Columbia and is held in the BC archives, noted the gap between the current evidence base and the sanatorium's clinical program. The review was internal. It was not published. It was not provided to patient advocacy organizations. Its recommendations for an accelerated transition to antibiotic-based outpatient care were not implemented on the timeline the review proposed. The farm continued. The temperature columns continued. The patients continued to arrive. The review was filed. The institution continued. Not one medical superintendent was asked, in any public proceeding, to account for the gap between what the 1952 review had found and what the institution continued to do. The closure of Tranquille as a tuberculosis sanatorium in 1958 was not a dramatic reckoning. It was an administrative transition, the product of declining patient numbers as antibiotic treatment became standard and community-based care displaced institutional care, and the product of the province's assessment that the facility's large building stock could be repurposed rather than closed entirely. The Anti-Tuberculosis Society of BC, which had founded the institution and maintained organizational involvement through the sanatorium years, wound down its operational role as the patient population declined. The provincial government assumed direct administrative control of the transition. In 1958, Tranquille reopened as the Tranquille Colony, a residential institution for adults and children with intellectual disabilities, a population that the province's institutional care infrastructure in the 1950s housed in large residential facilities using much of the same architectural and operational model as the sanatorium. Former sanatorium patients who had been long-term residents of the institution were discharged in the transition years with the abruptness characteristic of deinstitutionalization before that word existed as a policy concept. Some received no follow-up support. Some were discharged to communities they had not lived in for years, to families that had reorganized around their absence, to a world that had changed during the decade or more they had spent in the wards. The survivors who were healthy enough to advocate for themselves, a minority of those who had passed through Tranquille, were not organized in the late 1950s in the way that later survivor movements would organize. The TB survivor community in BC never formed an organization capable of sustained political pressure. The closure of the sanatorium resolved the immediate institutional question without producing any examination of what the institution had done during its 51 years of operation. The Tranquille colony operated on the same grounds until 1983, when the deinstitutionalization movement produced its own closure. The property was subsequently sold and eventually developed as a winery and resort operation, the Tranquille Farm Fresh, whose promotional materials describe the historic buildings, the lake setting, and the agricultural heritage of the property without specifying what the agricultural heritage consisted of or who had performed it. In 2012, the provincial government designated the Tranquille site as a heritage property. The designation covers the architectural and historical significance of the buildings. It does not describe the patient labor program, the racial segregation of Chinese Canadian patients, the continued sanatorium admissions after streptomycin evidence, or the 1952 internal review. The designation is on the buildings. The history is in the archives. The sanatorium movement was not a Canadian phenomenon. It was a global one, and the practices embedded in it, including the patient labor programs and the institutional economies they supported, traveled across every country where sanatoria were built, which by the early 20th century meant most of the industrialized world. In Switzerland, where the sanatorium movement originated, institutions at Davos and Lausanne ran labor programs structurally identical to Tranquille's. In the United States, sanatoria operated by state and county governments across the Northeast and Midwest combined the rest cure with patient labor in the laundry, kitchen, and farm operations that the same administrative logic produced. The work is therapy, the therapy generates output, the output offsets cost. The patients generating the output received no wages because they were not workers, they were patients. The World Health Organization's global tuberculosis control programs, launched in the post-war period as streptomycin and later isoniazid, transformed the treatment landscape, faced a specific challenge in countries where the sanatorium model had become economically embedded, where institutions, their staff, and the regional economies surrounding them had organized around a treatment model that the antibiotics made obsolete. The challenge was not primarily scientific. It was institutional. How do you dismantle a system whose stakeholders have strong incentives to maintain it, and whose patients, the people whose testimony might produce political pressure, are typically too ill, too poor, or too institutionally isolated to exercise that pressure themselves? The WHO's TB programs did not uniformly resolve this tension. In several countries, sanatorium model institutions persisted for years or decades after antibiotic treatment became available, supported by the same combination of institutional inertia, capital investment, and political economy that kept Tranquille open until 1958. The Cold War medical ethics framework that developed through the 1950s and 1960s, emerging from the Nuremberg doctors' trial, formalized in the Declaration of Helsinki, operationalized eventually in the Research Ethics Board infrastructure that Canadian hospitals adopted through the 1970s, addressed the specific problem of experimental research on institutionalized populations. It did not specifically address the problem of continuing a standard clinical protocol after the evidence base for that protocol had collapsed. That gap, between research ethics and clinical ethics, between the consent required for experiments and the accountability required for treatments, is a gap the Tranquille case illustrates, but that the developing ethics framework of the era was not designed to close. Patients in institutions are not only at risk from research that violates their consent, they are at risk from treatment that continues past the point its evidence supports, because the institution has reasons, financial, reputational, operational, to prefer continuation. The accountability mechanism for that failure is different from the accountability mechanism for research consent, and it is, in most institutional frameworks, weaker. The buildings at Tranquille stand on the north shore of Kamloops Lake, 40 minutes from the city. The main building, the one with the south-facing galleries that patients sat in, blanket-wrapped, facing the water, has been renovated. Its windows are clean. The gallery railings, where they survive, hold their original line. The view from the upper floors is unchanged. The lake pale and wide below, the dry hills behind, the quality of light that the sanatorium's founders described as curative, and that the antibiotic evidence determined was simply beautiful. The farm buildings are gone. The fields have been absorbed into the property's vineyard operations. The Tranquille Farm, fresh winery, produces wine from grapes, grown in the former agricultural grounds of the institution. Their website describes the heritage of the property. It describes the buildings. It describes the agricultural tradition of the site. The institutional cemetery above the farm still contains the graves of patients who died at Tranquille during the sanatorium years and the colony years that followed. Some are marked with names. Some are marked with numbers. The numbered graves, patients whose remains were claimed by no one or who arrived without documentation adequate to establish a name the institution felt confident recording, represent a category of person the institution housed completely. Arrived, were numbered, died, were buried with the number. The BC Heritage Register entry for the Tranquille site notes the historical and architectural significance of the buildings. It does not note the cemetery. It does not note the patient labor program. It does not note the racial segregation of Chinese Canadian patients. It does not note the 1952 internal review. It does not note that the institution admitted patients to a superseded treatment protocol for a decade after the evidence against that protocol was in the possession of the BC Department of Health. The quarterly farm reports are in the BC archives. The temperature charts are in the BC archives, or were until the routine archival review periods applicable to provincial health records began to expire. The 1952 internal review is in the BC archives. The admission registers, listing 9,000 names, are in the BC archives. No provincial government has announced an inquiry. No process has been established to read the quarterly farm reports against the temperature charts. No marker on the Tranquille site identifies what the numbered graves hold or explains why some graves have numbers and not names. The winery produces a Syrah and a Chardonnay. Their labels carry images of the historic buildings. The buildings look beautiful in the label images. They always did. There are 2 Tranquille Sanatoria in the historical record, and naming them side by side is the only honest way to describe what the institution was. The first Tranquille was built and operated by people who believed, with the conviction that the published medical literature of their era supported, in the complete absence of any better option, that the rest cure, the mountain air, and the graduated exercise were medicine. That institution took in people who were dying and gave them a beautiful place to pursue the hope that they might not die. Some patients improved. Some were discharged to longer lives than they would otherwise have had. The care was genuine in the sense that care can be genuine when it is also inadequate. That first Tranquille deserves to be named accurately. The second Tranquille is also in the record. It ran the farm on the labor of dying people and documented the offset in quarterly reports to the province. It segregated Chinese Canadian patients in a separate building with lower staffing ratios and attributed the segregation to hygiene rather than racism. It received the streptomycin evidence in 1948 and continued admitting patients to the sanatorium cure for another decade. It filed an internal review in 1952 that identified the gap between the current evidence and the institution's clinical practice, and then filed it. Both Tranquilles used the same thermometers. Both measured temperature in the same ruled columns. Both administered the same rest cure and assigned the same labor and recorded the same results in the same administrative buildings on the same shore of the same lake. The difference between them is not architectural. It is not staff or setting or even intention. It is accountability, the specific structural absence of any person or body required to read the 2 columns together and answer the question the gap between them produced. Some questions the record leaves open. How many patients performed farm labor at Tranquille, while their own temperature charts showed readings indicative of active pulmonary disease? The farm superintendent's quarterly reports and the patient medical files are both in the BC archives. The cross-referencing has not been performed systematically in any public or academic setting. What did the 1952 internal review specifically recommend? And what happened to those recommendations in the internal processes of the BC Department of Health? The document has been cited in academic research, but has not been reproduced or publicly analyzed in its entirety. Who are the people buried under numbers in the institutional cemetery? And can their names be recovered from the admission registers? The numbered graves cross-reference to admission numbers. The admission registers are in the archives. Whether the work of recovering those names has been undertaken, whether anyone has sat with the two documents in the same room and done the matching, is not a question with a confirmed public answer. Will there be a formal acknowledgement from the provincial government? The heritage designation exists. It is not an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement would require reading the quarterly farm reports against the temperature charts and making a statement about what the two documents together describe. The glass thermometer that was issued to every patient on arrival at Tranquille was a small object, 7 inches of sealed glass, the mercury thread visible within it, the graduated scale printed along its length in the calibrations that medicine requires to be precise. It was the first thing the institution gave you. The nurse came to your bed at 6 in the morning and you put it under your tongue and waited, and she recorded the reading in the ruled column. She came again at 6 in the evening and recorded again. At the opening of this story, the thermometer looked like medicine at its most attentive. An institution tracking your progress morning and evening, every day, without exception. Caring enough to measure. Caring enough to keep the record. By now you know what the record was for. The temperature column measured the approach of something the institution was not prepared to name plainly and was not required by any authority to name at all. The column went up. The institution recorded the number. The labor assignment for the following morning was on the bulletin board. The glass thermometer is gone from Tranquille now. The institution that used it is gone. The buildings stand, and the lake is still pale in the morning, and the hills are still brown against the sky. The quarterly reports are in the archives. The temperature charts, those that survive, are in the archives. Arthur Lim's admission number is in the farm superintendent's quarterly report for the spring of 1927. James Forsyth's admission number is in the soil above the farm. Dorothy Mather's letters are in a box in the Kamloops Museum. They are waiting, as records wait, for someone with authority to read them together and say what the reading means. The column is still there. The number is still in it. We are still waiting for the province to tell us what it recorded.